Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Voyager, where history drifts like a tide and journeys unfold slowly. Tonight's voyage takes us into silent nights with John Wesley Powell on the Colorado River. Have you ever wondered what it might feel like to float beneath canyon walls so high they erase the horizon? To look up at a narrow slice of sky where stars gather like spilled silver, while below you the river whispers a song older than memory? That is where we are headed tonight, into the deep silence of the canyons, with Powell and his men as quiet companions. If these calm wanderings bring you comfort, feel free to like or subscribe, only if it feels right. Share in the comments where and when you're listening. It is always a joy to see where our quiet fleet gathers. Now dim the lights, perhaps let a soft hum or fan play like the wind, and let's drift into the story of Powell's voyage. If your thoughts wander, that is fine. We will still be sailing onward. It begins not with thunder or rapids, but with stillness. The night before departure, the men stood beside their boats at Green River Station, Wyoming. It was May 24th, 1869, a date that would enter history, though none of them could have known it then. The air was cool, scented with sage and distant rain. The river itself seemed half asleep, drifting past in gentle swirls of reflected starlight. Imagine standing there with them, boots on gravel, hands resting on oars, hearing the faint creak of timbers settling. John Wesley Powell, their leader, was a man marked by both war and curiosity. He had lost his right arm at Shiloh during the Civil War, yet here he stood, ready to guide wooden boats into a labyrinth of unknown canyons. He carried notebooks and instruments wrapped in oilskin, determined to make sense of the rocks, the waters, the very bones of the earth itself. Yet what strikes us tonight is not the science or the hardship, but the silence. The way Powell paused often, gazing at the river as though it were a living thing, a companion rather than an obstacle. The boats were stout, clumsy looking to modern eyes, painted black and heavy with flour, bacon, dried apples and coffee. They bore names as whimsical as children's nicknames: Maid of the Canyon, Kitty Clyde's sister, and one christened No Name, as if already carrying a shrug of uncertainty. Each vessel was a floating home, a fragile shell of wood that would face rocks sharp as knives and waters wild as galloping horses. But tonight they lay still, moored to the banks, lantern-like glimmering off wet planks. The men themselves were a patchwork company, mountain men hardened by frontier winters, soldiers who still carried echoes of battle in their gait, and adventurers chasing the thrill of being first. Around the fire they passed tin cups of coffee, the dark brew mixing with the smoke of damp driftwood. Voices rose and fell, half joking, half nervous. One man cursed the bacon rations, swearing they would all smell of grease before the month was out. Another teased that their flour sacks would leap into the river at the first chance, already yearning to turn to paste. Laughter rippled through the group, easing the tension, though each knew that behind the humour lay fear. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the scene. The fire throws shifting light against their faces. Beyond the glow, the wilderness looms, endless sagebrush plains rolling into darkness, and the river winding silently away into unseen gorges. The men are not heroes tonight, not yet explorers etched into textbooks, but simply figures around a campfire, warming their hands, listening to the restless current. Powell sat apart, notebook open on his knee, writing by the small halo of his lantern. His pen moved steadily, though he paused often to look up, scanning the cliffs. Perhaps he was less recording facts than holding on to fragments of wonder. He had seen battlefields, had lost blood and limb, and yet here he sought a different conquest, not of men but of silence, of landscapes no map yet held. He once wrote that the canyons were a book whose leaves were stone, and tonight he seemed eager to begin turning those pages. And then, the wow moment, lift your eyes with his. Between canyon edges and drifting clouds, The stars stretch in impossible numbers, the Milky Way pouring down like a river of fire above the dark river below. Imagine standing there, feeling the earth tilt under the weight of so many stars. In that moment, Powell and his crew were not just men about to embark on a dangerous journey. They were small figures suspended between two rivers, one of water, one of light, both flowing toward unknown horizons. The night deepened. One by one, men stretched out on blankets along the sandy bank, boots still on, hats tilted low. The fire burned down to coals, glowing like small embers mirroring the stars overhead. The boats, moored but restless, knocked softly against the shore, timbers sighing with the current. The river's voice grew clearer as other sounds faded, the eternal murmur of water carrying silt, carrying memory, carrying them toward mystery. Picture yourself among them, lying back on the cool sand, wrapped in a blanket. Feel the hush of the canyon night, the gentle weight of stars pressing down. Let the steady rhythm of the water be your lullaby, a promise that though rapids and storms may come, tonight belongs to silence, to stillness, to beginnings. When Powell finally closed his notebook, he sat for a long while, his lantern dim against the enormity of the sky. He must have felt what you feel now, that time itself slows here, that the river is less a path than a pause, less a challenge than an invitation. The night held them in its wide embrace, and so it can hold you too. The morning came slowly, not with fanfare but with the soft glow of pale light spilling across the riverbank. Mist lifted in veils from the surface of the green river, blurring the line between water and sky. The men stirred, rubbing sleep from their eyes, shaking sand from their blankets, boots stiff with dew. The fire had burned down to ash, though a few faint curls of smoke rose into the morning air. Above them the cliffs remained solemn and still, guardians watching silently as the company prepared to step into the unknown. It is easy to imagine the clumsy choreography of their first movements, lifting packs, checking ropes, retying knots. They were not yet a seamless crew. They were individuals learning to move together, a group of strangers bound by a single decision to follow Powell into the depths of an unmapped world. Some moved briskly, eager to be on the water, while others dragged their feet, delaying the inevitable plunge into uncertainty. Yet there was no turning back now. Behind them lay the frontier town, with its wooden station house and tracks of the new railroad. Before them stretched a wilderness that swallowed maps whole, a corridor of stone and silence. The boats waited at the river's edge, heavy with provisions. Each had been built sturdy, thick-planked and flat-bottomed, but they were already scarred by the scraping of sand and rock during their initial trials. Their names, painted in simple letters, gave them personalities. Maid of the Canyon sounded like a graceful companion, though her bulk was anything but delicate. Kitty Clyde's sister carried the echo of a half-forgotten song, whimsical and oddly affectionate. No name, plain and defiant, seemed to resist any attempt to define it. There were others as well, each vessel assigned to a portion of supplies, flour stacked carefully in barrels, coffee wrapped in canvas, bacon hanging from hooks. These small luxuries, packed with calculation, would become the daily rhythm of their survival. Step closer in your mind, and imagine running a hand along the wooden side of one of these boats. The surface is rough, smelling of pitch and river water. The ropes creak as they pull against mooring stakes. Inside, the provisions are lashed down in careful bundles, though the men joke that no lash can keep flour dry once the river decides otherwise. Already they speak of the food with the tone of men who know it too well. Bacon is greasy, flour unpredictable, coffee bitter and thin. Yet together these simple rations will carry them for weeks, sustaining not only their bodies but the fragile fabric of their morale. The men themselves deserve to be seen not as anonymous figures, but as distinct presences. One was tall and lanky, with a drawl that carried easily across the water. Another was short and broad, a soldier still in his bearing, quick to bark a command even when no one asked for it. One had a habit of humming under his breath, a fragment of music carried from another life. Another kept mostly silent, his eyes always drifting toward the cliffs, as though he heard something in the stone that the others could not. Around them all moved Powell, calm and deliberate, his sleeve pinned neatly where an arm should have been. His authority was quiet rather than loud, but it settled over the group like the gravity of the cliffs themselves. Close your eyes for a moment and place yourself among them. You stand at the river's edge, lantern now extinguished, morning air crisp in your lungs. The boats bob softly against the current, impatient yet restrained. You hear the shuffle of boots on gravel, the clink of tin cups being packed away, the muttered words of men checking ropes and oars. There is no crowd to cheer them on, no band playing, only the whisper of water and the rustle of canvas. The world seems to hold its breath as the first boat is eased into the river. One by one the men climb aboard. The oars dip, the hull groans, and the current claims them. It is not dramatic at first. The river is calm, the surface rippling gently under the morning breeze. Yet beneath the calm lies power, a hidden pulse that will soon show its teeth. For now, though, it is almost serene, as though the river is granting them a grace period, a moment of calm before it reveals its true character. Powell sat near the stern of one boat, his eyes scanning both river and cliffs. In his notebook he would later write of the beauty of those first stretches, the green banks lined with cottonwood, the distant mountains faint against the horizon. But the men noticed other things, how the boats rode low under their loads, how the current tugged harder in some places, how the sound of water changed where rocks broke the surface. These were not scientific observations, but instinctive ones, born of a desire simply to remain afloat. Still, humour surfaced even here. When one boat snagged briefly on a sandbar, the men laughed that it was the flower finally seeking its destiny as paste. Another joked that bacon rations should be tied directly to the boat's underside so that the river could season them with mud. Such jokes were small shields against the vastness of the journey ahead, but they worked. Laughter rose and mingled with the echo of oars, filling the canyon morning with something almost cheerful. Imagine floating with them now. The water laps against the boat, cool spray touching your face. The cliffs on either side rise higher as the river bends, their shadows lengthening even though the sun has barely climbed the sky. Birds wheel above, their cries faint in the immensity. You feel the boat sway gently beneath you, every creak and groan a reminder of its fragility, every splash of the oar a heartbeat marking time. Powell must have known that the men carried both awe and fear. He let them talk, let them joke, but he also spoke with calm certainty. His words were not lofty but practical, simple reminders to keep balance, to watch for sudden currents, to tie supplies more securely. It was this blend of silence and measured instruction that steadied them. He was not only the leader of an expedition, he was the keeper of their trust, a trust that would be tested again and again. By midday, the company had drifted miles from Green River Station. Behind them, the last hints of settlement had vanished. Ahead, the river curved into canyons that darkened as the cliffs grew taller, their walls painted with bands of red and grey. The men fell into rhythm, oars dipping, boats drifting, water carrying them deeper into mystery. The sense of departure was no longer theoretical. They were committed now, bound to the river's will, moving into silence no map could chart. The river carried them forward, almost shyly at first, as though it wished to give the boats a gentle introduction before revealing its true strength. The men sat at their oars, watching the water slide past in smooth ripples, the hulls gliding without resistance. There was a quiet music in it, the creak of oarlocks, the steady splash of blades dipping, the low sigh of current against wood. The canyon walls were not yet towering. The banks spread wide, lined with willow and cottonwood, their leaves whispering in the morning breeze. Birds darted across the surface, their wings flashing silver in the rising sun. Powell leaned back slightly, his one arm guiding the tiller rope, eyes always scanning ahead. He had spoken little since departure, but his silence was not indifference. It was the silence of listening to the river, to the echo of cliffs, to the rhythm of his men settling into their first strokes. The river to him was less an enemy than a teacher. He believed it would speak if you paid attention, and he had every intention of learning its language. The men, however, did not all share this patience. Some rowed too hard, pulling unevenly, as if the river might be tamed by force. Others let their oars drag, trusting the current to do the work. A few muttered about how heavy the boats felt, how low they rode in the water. It was clear that these first miles were not merely practice in rowing, but in cooperation. The river demanded a unity of motion, and unity is not always easily found among strangers. Imagine yourself seated on the wooden bench of one of those boats, oar in hand, feet braced against a damp plank. The air smells of river mud and sun-warmed pine from the distant ridges. The current nudges you forward with a strength that is gentle but insistent, like a hand on your back guiding you along. The cliffs are beginning to rise now, not sheer walls yet, but slopes of red and grey stone that draw the eye upward. You feel at once small and safe, as if entering a corridor where time moves at a slower pace. The first challenge came not as a roaring cataract, but as a subtle quickening of the water. Ahead, the surface darkened, flecked with tiny waves, the kind that whisper of hidden rocks beneath. The men fell silent, their laughter replaced by the concentrated hush of those who sense change approaching. Powell raised his hand, not the empty sleeve but his left, steady and commanding, and signalled for caution. The boat slowed, hugging the current, oars ready. To modern eyes it might seem minor, just a ripple where the river narrows. But to these men, with their heavy loads and fragile hulls, it was a first test. The bow dipped, the stern lifted slightly, and for a moment the boat's heart seemed to race. Water slapped against the planks, spraying cool against their faces. Then, just as quickly, the turbulence passed, leaving behind a wide, calm pool where reflections of the cliffs floated undisturbed. Laughter broke out then, half relief, half bravado. One man declared it was nothing more than the river clearing its throat. Another teased that Powell's careful hand signals were for a ripple fit only for ducks. Powell himself smiled faintly but said nothing, simply noting in his journal that the river had revealed its first hint of character. To him, it was not a ripple at all, but a word in the language he meant to decipher. The morning stretched on. Sunlight grew stronger, casting sharp shadows along the canyon's layered slopes. The men began to notice how the walls were painted in bands of colour, deep reds, soft greys, ochres that glowed when touched by light. Powell explained almost gently that these were stories written in stone, each layer a chapter from an age when seas covered the land or rivers long vanished carved their paths. The men listened, not always grasping the geology but feeling the weight of history pressed into the cliffs. To them it was enough to know that the rocks were old, older than their own imagination could stretch. Pause with them here and imagine drifting through that painted corridor. The air grows warmer, the water darker. The cliffs seem to lean closer as the river bends. Every sound you make, an oar dipping, a cough, a low whistle, returns to you, softer, altered, as though the canyon itself is considering your presence before answering. You feel wrapped in echoes, part of a dialogue between stone and water that has gone on for ages. By midday they pulled ashore on a gravel bar to rest and eat. Bacon was unwrapped and cooked over a quick fire, its smell strong in the dry air. Coffee was brewed, thick and bitter, poured into dented tin cups. The men chewed slowly, glancing at the cliffs, speaking in quieter tones than the night before. The river had shown them that even its gentlest moods carried power, and the laughter of camp seemed less sure now. Powell sketched in his notebook, lines quick and precise, while others mended straps or checked ropes. They set off again, and soon the river narrowed further. The water deepened in colour, flowing faster, tugging the boats with greater urgency. The men tightened their grips, strokes more coordinated now. Powell nodded to himself, sensing that they were beginning to find rhythm, beginning to hear the same pulse. Yet even as they gained confidence, a whisper of unease lingered. If these small ripples felt so uncertain, what lay ahead in the true depths of the canyons? The sun slid toward afternoon, light angling sharply into the gorge. Shadows grew long, stretching like fingers across the water. The boats glided on, steady but watchful, every man alert to the shifting moods of the river. There was no turning back. The current had taken hold, and here is the wow moment of this day. As they rounded a bend, the walls suddenly reared higher, cliffs blazing red in the sun. The river became a glowing hallway, as if they had drifted into a furnace of light. The men sat in awe, their voices stilled. Powell wrote later that the gorge seemed aflame, and he named it Flaming Gorge. In that instant, the river was not merely water and stone, but fire as well. A triad of elements fused into one overwhelming vision. Imagine it for yourself, rowing slowly as cliffs burn around you, the water reflecting their glow so that you seem to float on molten light. Above, the sky narrows to a ribbon. Around you, silence deepens, broken only by the whisper of oars. You're no longer on an ordinary river. You're within something vast and mysterious, something that humbles even the bravest. The first currents had spoken, quietly but firmly. They had promised beauty, and they had hinted at danger. The men carried on, hearts beating faster, eyes wide, pulled deeper into a world no map had dared to capture. The sun dipped lower, the long shafts of light softening from gold into amber, then into a muted rose that spread across the canyon walls. The river slowed in places, its surface broken only by small eddies that turned lazily before merging again with the flow. After hours of rowing, the men felt the weight in their shoulders and hands, the ache of muscles not yet accustomed to such labour. Powell gave a quiet signal, and the boat steered toward a wide gravel bar where they could beach for the night. The landing was awkward, for the river resisted even in its gentler stretches. The current pressed against the hulls, grinding them sideways as the men struggled with oars and poles. Boots splashed into the shallows as ropes were thrown, stakes hammered into the gravel. The smell of wet rope and pitch mixed with the earthy scent of the riverbank. Finally the boats rested, their weight settled on the sand as the men leaned heavily on their oars, catching their breath. There was a hush to that moment, the hush of men grateful to stand on solid ground again. They moved slowly, unloading bundles, carrying provisions up the bank, stacking barrels of flour and crates of bacon beneath a cluster of willows. Each motion had a rhythm to it. The thud of sacks dropped on gravel, the creak of leather straps loosened, the scrape of tin cups pulled from packs. It was a rhythm not unlike the river's own pulse, steady, inevitable, binding them together. Soon the first sparks of fire lit against the gathering dark. Driftwood was piled, struck with flint, coaxed into flame. Smoke curled upward, thin at first, then thickening as sticks caught and crackled. The men crouched close, warming their hands, faces bathed in shifting orange light. Above them the cliffs faded into silhouette, jagged edges against a sky deepening toward indigo. Stars began to blink awake, timid at first, then bold, until the canyon roof was scattered with them. The meal was simple but deeply welcome. Slices of bacon sizzled in blackened pans, their grease spitting into the flames. coffee boiled in dented pots, bitter and strong, poured steaming into tin mugs. The smell of the bacon rose rich and salty, mingling with the smoke, filling the air with a comfort that almost masked the dampness of river clothes and the rawness of blistered hands. The men ate hungrily, chewing without complaint, their earlier jokes about the monotony of the rations softened by hunger. Even flour boiled into a heavy paste called slapjacks was eaten in silence, washed down with coffee too dark to see the bottom of the cup. Now imagine yourself among them. You sit cross-legged on the gravel, the warmth of the fire on your face, the cool night air pressing against your back. You hold a tin cup between your palms, feeling its metal sting with heat. Around you, the boats rest like tired animals, their shapes half-shadowed against the water. The river murmurs steadily behind, its voice softened by distance, as though it too has settled into evening. As the fire crackled, talk began to rise. One man, younger than the rest, told a story about his first winter in the mountains when he nearly froze in a snowstorm before stumbling into the cabin of a trapper who saved him with nothing but strong tea and a roaring fire. Another spoke of a battlefield far away, his voice low, carrying memories too heavy to share in detail. Laughter followed, though gently, when someone interrupted with a tale of a horse that refused to be broken and ended up pulling a plough only when bribed with apples. The stories wove together like threads, some bright, some dark, binding the group into something more than strangers. Powell listened more than he spoke, his notebook once again in his lap, though the light was too dim for real writing. Instead, he traced lines with his eyes, the curves of cliffs, the sparks rising from the fire, the patterns of stars framed by canyon walls. He seemed content to let the men speak, to let the river of their voices flow. Now and then he added a quiet comment, steady and calm, reminding them that the real work lay ahead, but that tonight was for rest. Picture the fire's glow against the faces, the way shadows stretched across their features, softening hard lines, turning each man into a figure both ancient and immediate. It is not difficult to imagine how countless others, long before Powell's expedition, must have camped in this same way. Fire on gravel, stories rising into the dark, stars wheeling above. The canyon seemed to lean in, listening, as if acknowledging this continuity of human presence. When the last scraps of bacon had been eaten and the coffee cooled to dregs, the men prepared their makeshift beds. Some spread blankets directly on the gravel, heads pillowed on rolled-up coats. Others lay close to the fire, unwilling to surrender its warmth even for sleep. Boots remained on, for the ground was rough and the night cool. The fire burned low, embers glowing like small constellations on the earth. And then the silence came. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of fullness. The silence of water slipping past unseen, of wind brushing through willows, of distant rock cooling under starlight. Each man lay still, eyes heavy, bodies surrendering to weariness. The river hummed its steady lullaby, a sound that seemed both near and eternal. Now close your eyes and let yourself drift with them. Imagine lying on your own blanket by the fire, the air cool, the ground solid beneath you. Above, the stars glimmer in their millions, framed by the black cut of the canyon walls. The fire pops softly, sending up sparks that fade before reaching the sky. Somewhere a man snores, low and steady. Somewhere else another shifts, muttering in sleep. The boats creak faintly against their ropes, rocked by the current. It is a night without urgency, a night of rest before trials yet to come. Powell, before finally lying down, gazed at the stars one last time. Perhaps he felt as though he were floating between two immensities, the infinite sky above, the deep canyon below. He carried that image with him into sleep, and it lingers still, an echo of the first camp along the Colorado's long journey. Morning returned with a hush, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath. Mist hung low over the river, blurring its edges so that water and sky seemed woven together. The men stirred from their gravel beds, stretching stiff arms, shaking the dust from their coats, and bending over the embers of the fire to coax it back into life. The smell of smoke drifted upward again, joined quickly by the familiar sizzle of bacon, the sharp bitterness of coffee, and the heavy smell of flour being mixed into coarse cakes. The breakfast was plain, but after a night on the ground it was enough to anchor them for another day of rowing. The boats, damp from the night's dew, were loaded once again, ropes untied, oars fitted into their locks. With quiet determination, the men pushed off from the bank. The gravel crunched under their boots, then was left behind, swallowed by the river's gentle pull. The current embraced them with its slow insistence, and soon they were adrift once more between the canyon walls. At first the gorge was subtle, its slopes not yet steep, covered in patches of brush and scattered trees. But as the river turned, the walls drew closer, and the colour of the stone deepened. Bands of red began to glow in the morning sun, faint at first like coals beneath ash. Then, with each mile, the colour grew more vivid, until the cliffs themselves seemed to burn with inner fire. Powell sat upright, his eyes fixed on the sight ahead. The men felt it too, that sudden shift in the mood of the land. The canyon had transformed from a quiet corridor into a vast furnace, a place where stone itself carried flame. Every ripple of the water reflected those red walls, so that the river looked like molten copper flowing through a cavern of fire. Powell wrote later that the gorge seemed aflame, and in that moment he gave it a name: Flaming Gorge. The words carried no flourish, no need for ornament. The cliffs had already spoken for themselves. His naming was less an invention than an acknowledgement, a way of marking the astonishment they all felt. Now pause and picture it yourself. Imagine drifting in one of those heavy boats, the oars dipping steadily, while all around you the canyon glows as though the sun has set the very earth alight. The cliffs rise higher than any building, their faces striated in reds and oranges, each layer catching the light differently. The air feels warmer, the river narrower, the silence more profound. The men pull at their oars, but their eyes lift again and again to the walls, unable to look away. The first true awe of the journey settled over them here. There was little conversation. A few murmurs, a quiet whistle, then nothing. Even the joking voices that had carried through campfires and ripples grew hushed, as though laughter itself would be out of place. The canyon had claimed their attention, reminding them that they were small, fragile figures within an immensity that cared nothing for their presence. Powell, though always a man of science, felt the poetry of it. He had spoken before of the earth as a great book, its layers, pages of history pressed together. Here he seemed to turn one of its most dramatic chapters. He explained softly to the men how each band of colour represented an age of seas, deserts and rivers long vanished, how each stratum was older than any city or battle they had known. The men listened, not grasping every detail, but catching the reverence in his tone. The rocks, they understood, were old beyond reckoning. As the sun rose higher, the colours shifted again. Shadows stretched across the gorge, darkening some walls while others blazed brighter. The river took on the colours of the cliffs, shimmering red and gold, so that the boat seemed to float through liquid fire. The men rowed slowly, more to linger than to escape. Even hunger was forgotten, until one finally muttered about coffee left behind in his cup. The comment drew faint laughter, though quiet, as if not to disturb the gorge's fiery majesty. They pulled ashore briefly at midday, seeking shade beneath an outcrop. The heat within the gorge was heavier than they expected, the air trapped between stone walls thick and still. They ate quickly, bacon again, coffee again, and filled their canteens from the river. One man splashed water on his face, gasping at the shock of cold. while another leaned back against the rock and closed his eyes, as though even sleep would be painted in red. Powell climbed a short slope, his notebook in hand, sketching the layers, labelling them with the neat marks of his training. He noted not only the geology but also the strange beauty, describing how the gorge seemed to blaze with the fire of its own making. His words captured more than fact. They carried awe, a quiet reverence that balanced science with wonder. Imagine climbing beside him, standing on a ledge just high enough to look back at the river winding through the gorge. From above, the boats are dark specks on a glowing path, tiny against the immensity of stone. The sound of the river rises faintly, blending with the occasional call of a bird echoing against the walls. You feel both exalted and diminished, both privileged to witness and humbled to belong. By late afternoon they launched again, the shadows lengthening, the gorge shifting once more into new shades. The fire of morning softened into deep maroons and purples, the river darkening as the sun slipped toward the horizon. The gorge, once aflame, now seemed to cool, as if the day had banked its fires and prepared for rest. The men rode in silence, exhausted, but still under the spell of what they had seen. When they finally camped again on a small gravel shelf, their movements were slower, their voices softer. The fire burned as it always did, bacon fried as it always did, but there was a difference in their demeanour. They had seen something immense, something that would not leave them. Even as they lay down to sleep, the glow of the gorge seemed to linger behind their closed eyes. And as you close your eyes with them, imagine drifting back through the flaming walls, their colours still alive, the river still glowing, the silence still heavy. The gorge is not gone. It remains, a chapter written in stone, waiting for all who drift upon its waters. The days of easy drifting could not last forever. The green river, calm and reflective in its upper reaches, began to gather a different voice as the boats pressed deeper into the canyon. It started subtly, an occasional hiss of water over rocks, a quickening in the current, a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere ahead but out of sight. The men noticed it in the way their oars tugged differently, the way the boat shivered under their weight, the way the air itself seemed to vibrate faintly. The river was preparing to speak in tones far louder than its gentle murmurs. They rounded a bend and the sound grew sharper, echoing against the cliffs. Ahead the water darkened, curling and folding on itself, white foam flashing where the current struck hidden boulders. The gorge narrowed, its walls pressing closer, funneling the river into a restless channel. The surface no longer glided, it boiled. Powell raised his hand, calling for caution. The boat slowed, hugging the calmer water near the bank. Some of the men climbed out onto the rocks, peering ahead, their voices bouncing strangely between stone walls. What they saw was not the massive cataracts they had feared, but still enough to stir unease. The river tumbling over a stair of rocks forming standing waves that heaved and bucked. To the untrained eye it looked like chaos, water trying to climb out of its own channel. The men conferred in low tones. Some suggested portaging the boats around, dragging them laboriously over rocks. Others argued they should try the run, trusting the boats to ride through. Powell listened quietly, then decided they would row it. The river, he reasoned, was giving them a first test, not yet deadly, but demanding respect. They would meet it head-on. Imagine standing on the bank with them. The air is filled with the roar of water, a sound that pulses in your chest like distant thunder. The spray rises in faint mist, dampening your face even before the boats enter. The men grip their oars, boots braced, jaws tight. The ropes creak as they are cast off, and slowly, almost ceremoniously, the first boat drifts into the current. It happens quickly. The bow dips, the stern rises, and for a moment the boat seems to shudder like a startled animal. Water slaps against the planks, spraying cold across the men's faces. The oars dig hard, blades flashing, bodies straining in rhythm. The river surges around them, curling into waves that crash and recede in seconds. One man yells, another curses, but their voices are drowned in the roar. The boat lurches sideways, rights itself, then bursts through the final standing wave into calmer water. A shout rises, half laughter, half disbelief. They are through. The second boat follows, then the third. Each wrestles with the same turmoil, sudden drops, violent splashes, the sharp slap of water against wood. Yet each emerges battered but afloat, rocking wildly but unbroken. The current carries them into a wide pool where the river relaxes again, its fury spent, as if amused by their struggle. For a moment, no one speaks. The men sit drenched, hair-plastered, shirts heavy with water. Their breath comes in quick gasps, their arms trembling from the effort. Then, as the silence of the calmer pool surrounds them, one man bursts into laughter. Another joins, then another, until the canyon echoes not with the roar of rapids, but with human voices, bright and unrestrained. The fear has passed, and what remains is exhilaration. One of them, wiping water from his face, swears loudly that the flour sacks had swum better than the boat. The joke sparks renewed laughter, even as they glance nervously at the barrels of provisions to make sure the cargo has survived. Miraculously, nothing essential is lost. Though some bacon is damp and a bag of flour has indeed been soaked beyond rescue, they drag it ashore at the next stop, poke at the sticky mess, and declare it the river's first meal. Powell, though wet and weary like the others, takes the moment to write a few lines in his notebook. His handwriting wavers from damp paper, but the words are steady. We run our first rapid and come out safe. For him, the importance is not merely survival, but proof that the boats can endure, that his men can trust themselves and the river enough to continue. He smiles faintly at their laughter, but in his eyes is a deeper light, the quiet satisfaction of a leader who sees his crew bound together by ordeal. Pause now and imagine sitting in one of those dripping boats, your hands raw from gripping the oar, your clothes soaked, your heart still racing. Around you, the cliffs rise solemn and immense, unmoved by the chaos you have just endured. The river flows on, its surface deceptively calm once more, as though the rapids were nothing more than a momentary flicker in its long story. You feel both small and alive, caught between fear and wonder, tasting the edge of danger but spared by fortune. They camped not long after, choosing a gravel shelf where they could dry their clothes and warm themselves by fire. The damp flour was spread out hopelessly, drawing teasing remarks about river bread and water biscuits. The men sat close to the flames, steam rising from their garments, smoke stinging their eyes. Stories of the day's passage flowed freely. How the bow nearly buried itself, how one man nearly lost his hat, how the river tried to claim them and failed. Each tale grew slightly taller, each laugh slightly louder. The hardship in memory became triumph. Powell watched them, content. He knew greater rapids lay ahead, far more dangerous than this first taste. But he also knew that fear, once shared and overcome, became a bond. The men had faced the river's first challenge and had answered with strength, clumsy though it might be. Tonight they laughed together, and laughter, in the depths of a canyon, was as vital as bread or bacon. The fire burned late into the night, sparks rising like fleeting stars into the dark. The river whispered beside them, calm again, as if it too needed rest. Above, the sky stretched unbroken, scattered with constellations. The canyon walls framed only a narrow slice of heavens, but in that slice the stars burned fiercely, their reflections trembling faintly on the black water. You lie back on the gravel now, hearing the laughter still echo, feeling the warmth of the fire, the cool breath of night on your face. The rapids are behind, but their memory remains in your heartbeat, steady and alive. The river has shown its first teeth, and you, like Powell and his men, have survived to drift further into the unknown. The morning after their first encounter with rapids came quietly, as if the river wished to balance its ferocity with gentleness. Mist lifted in pale ribbons from the water, dissolving into the soft blue of dawn. The men rose slowly, bodies still heavy from the strain of rowing against chaos, but their voices carried a different timbre now, less nervous, more assured. They had faced the river's first test and survived, and that knowledge lay like a hidden warmth within them. The boats, though damp and scarred, were made ready once again, oars fitted back into their locks, ropes untied, provisions checked and secured. The men pushed off with practiced effort, their movements already smoother than on the first days. The river welcomed them back into its arms, carrying them steadily into another day of discovery. The gorge narrowed as they drifted deeper. Cliffs began to rise higher, sheer faces of sandstone gleaming in the morning light. The colour was rich, layered, painted in reds, oranges and greys, each band telling of ages when deserts shifted, seas rose and ancient rivers carved paths long vanished. Powell pointed out the lines softly, explaining how each stratum was like a page in the book of the earth. Some men listened, nodding politely, though not all grasped the depth of his meaning. Still, they understood this much. They were surrounded by time itself, towering above them, silent yet immense. And then something strange began to happen. A man coughed, clearing his throat after drinking cold river water, and the sound returned, not once but again and again, bouncing across the canyon. The echo rolled back like a second voice, deeper and ghostly, fading only after several heartbeats. The men laughed, surprised, and one called out a word only to hear it come rushing back to him, bent and altered, as though the canyon itself were answering. Powell smiled faintly. He had heard echoes before, but here they were stronger, more insistent. The canyon had become a chamber, amplifying every sound until it seemed that unseen voices joined the crew. It was as though the river had led them into a cathedral, where stone and silence worked together to magnify even the smallest murmur. Imagine yourself seated in one of the boats now, drifting slowly, or resting across your knees. You call out a single syllable, perhaps your own name. At first there is only the sound of your voice, bright and sharp. Then the canyon gathers it, rolls it along its walls and sends it back to you multiplied, altered, as if carried by a chorus of unseen companions. You cannot help but smile, for it feels less like an echo and more like a conversation. The men experimented with it eagerly, shouting short phrases, laughing as the canyon mocked them with playful delay. One man sang a line from a soldier's song, and the walls turned it into a round, repeating the melody as if ghostly choirs had joined. Another whistled a simple tune, and it came back layered, haunting, a harmony created by stone. The laughter rang out louder, and the canyon sent it back in, booming waves until even the laughter became eerie, transformed into something beyond human. Powell let them play, though he himself remained quiet, listening. He thought of how sound, like water, was shaped by the land. Just as rapids formed where the river narrowed, so echoes formed where cliffs converged, bending voices into something new. To him, it was another lesson in the language of the canyon, one more sign that the landscape was alive, shaping not only the course of water, but the very shape of human expression. They called this stretch Echo Park, a name as inevitable as Flaming Gorge had been. It was not merely a description, but an invocation, a reminder that here the canyon itself was a participant in their journey. As the boats drifted deeper, silence eventually returned. The men grew tired of hearing their own voices tossed back at them. They rested their oars, letting the current carry them. The echoes faded, replaced by the natural sounds. The dip of water, the soft grind of wood against current, the occasional cry of a hawk circling above, yet even in silence they felt the presence of the echoes lingering like shadows. They landed at midday on a small sandy shelf to eat. Bacon again, coffee again, the familiar smells rising, the fire crackling faintly. But their talk carried new energy, their laughter still tinged with the canyon's ghostly answers. One man declared that the canyon must be haunted by the spirits of those who had walked here long before. Another suggested that perhaps the river itself had found a voice, teasing them with its mimicry. The jokes circled, but beneath them lay awe. They knew they had stumbled into a place where the land itself seemed conscious, listening and responding. Now pause and picture their camp in your imagination. The cliffs rise on both sides, curving inward like the walls of a vast hall. The fire burns small, but steady on the sand, its smoke curling upward before dissipating into the blue above. A man whistles idly, and faintly the canyon answers back, a ghostly refrain that fades into silence. You sit quietly, coffee cup warm in your hands, and feel the weight of time pressing gently from the cliffs. The place itself is not empty. It is full of presence, full of memory. As evening came, the men pushed off once more, reluctant to leave the magic of Echo Park, but eager to see what lay beyond. The canyon widened slightly, the echoes less insistent, the water calmer. Stars began to appear above, faint at first, then clear, shimmering in the narrow strip of sky. The boats glided almost silently, the men weary but content. Their laughter softened into murmurs. Powell gazed upward, notebook resting closed for once. Perhaps he felt what you might feel now, that Echo Park was less a place on a map and more an experience, a reminder that the world was alive in ways too subtle for maps to capture. It was not just stone and water, but sound and silence, weaving together to create something unforgettable. Close your eyes now and imagine your own voice rising into the night air, carried up by canyon walls, then return to you transformed. It is not your voice alone, but a chorus, as though the river itself has chosen to speak. You drift on, wrapped in that sound, a participant in the canyon's conversation, held gently between water and stone. The river was not content to remain playful. After the laughter of Echo Park, where voices had been tossed back in ghostly choruses, the gorge began to shift again. Its walls grew higher, its colours darker, its presence heavier. The men rowed in silence now, their oars dipping rhythmically, the water pulling them forward into a realm where sound no longer bounced back but was swallowed whole. It was as though the canyon had tired of games and wished to remind them of its gravity. The cliffs leaned closer with each bend, sheer walls of grey and ochre that cut off much of the sky. Where once broad light had warmed the river, now only narrow beams filtered down, striking the water like pale blades. Shadows pooled at the base of the walls, cool and unyielding, and the river itself seemed darker, its surface rippling in sullen folds. The men shifted uneasily, feeling the weight of stone above them, feeling the hush that pressed against their voices until even laughter seemed out of place. It was here that Powell would later give the name Desolation Canyon, and the title suited it well. This was not the fiery grandeur of Flaming Gorge, nor the playful music of Echo Park. This was solemnity, stripped of colour, stripped of echo. The canyon loomed like a vast cathedral where silence itself was the dominant hymn. The men felt it in their bodies. Their strokes grew heavier, shoulders aching, palms blistered from days of rowing. The sun, when it did pierce the cliffs, burned harshly, reflecting off the stone until the air shimmered with heat. Water splashed constantly, soaking boots, soaking trousers, leaving everything damp. The provisions suffered most, sacks of flour absorbing moisture until they sagged with the weight of paste, bacon turning slick and rancid around the edges, even the coffee losing its sharpness after too many dousings. They joked about it when they could, but hunger gnawed in quieter ways. Meals became less satisfying, more like obligations and comforts. Imagine yourself in one of those boats, the wood damp beneath you, the smell of spoiled bacon lingering, the ache of your hands raw from the oar. Around you the cliffs rise without mercy, blotting out most of the sky. The river pushes relentlessly forward, a voice too low to argue with. You glance at the faces of your companions, creased with fatigue, eyes narrowed against the glare. The silence among you is not born of peace, but of weariness, as if all the words have been swallowed by the stone. Tension surfaced in small sparks. When a rope slipped and a barrel rolled dangerously close to the gunwale, curses erupted. Two men shouted at one another, each blaming the other for carelessness. The sound was sharp, startling in the quiet canyon, bouncing once before being absorbed by the walls. For a moment it seemed the silence had cracked. That bitterness might spread. Yet as often happens in hardship, humour slipped in through the cracks. Another man, weary but grinning, remarked that if the barrel had rolled overboard, the river would finally taste the paste it had worked so hard to make. The laughter that followed was rough, forced at first, but genuine by the end. The quarrel dissolved, washed away like foam after a rapid. Powell observed quietly, his gaze steady. He knew well that hardship bred quarrels, but he also knew that quarrels, when eased with laughter, forged bonds stronger than any rope. He allowed the men to settle it themselves, then reminded them gently to check the lashings again, his voice even, as unshaken as the cliffs. The day wore on in the same rhythm, rowing, resting briefly on sandy shelves, rowing again. Meals were meagre, hard bread chewed slowly, bacon too salty, coffee thinned by too much water. The firewood, when they found it, burned green and smoky, stinging eyes and filling the air with a bitter scent. Still they pressed forward, deeper into desolation. Now close your eyes and imagine the night here. The fire is small, barely more than embers, for the canyon allows little driftwood. The men sit close, shoulders hunched, the glow flickering weakly against towering walls. Above, only a sliver of sky is visible, stars faint in their narrow frame. The river flows by, dark and secretive, carrying its voice away without echo. You lie back on your blanket, the ground cool, the air heavy, and you feel the weight of the canyon pressing down. Not hostile, but immense, reminding you of your own smallness. Powell, ever steady, wrote by lantern light. Though his words were briefer than before, he noted the geology, the sheer walls, the unbroken solitude. His handwriting carried the mark of fatigue, the lines less firm, yet his purpose did not waver. He recorded the canyon as he had promised himself he would, not merely for his own memory, but for the memory of the world. He believed that even desolation had meaning, that silence itself was a story worth telling. One man, unable to sleep, tossed pebbles into the river, listening as they plunked and vanished without echo. "This place doesn't even bother to answer back," he muttered, drawing a quiet laugh from the few still awake. The canyon in its way remained indifferent, its silence absolute. Yet perhaps that was its answer, a reminder that not every call requires a reply. The night deepened. The fire shrank. One by one, the men surrendered to sleep, wrapped in blankets still damp, boots still on. The canyon walls towered above, unyielding while the river slipped past, its voice low and steady, carrying them further into mystery. The day in Desolation Canyon had been long, heavy with silence and fatigue, and when evening finally came, the men welcomed it as if it were a friend returning after too much absence. The river had relented slightly, its voice softened into steady murmurs. The cliffs, though still immense, seemed less oppressive in the fading light, their harsh faces turning gentle shades of violet and grey, as the sun lowered itself beyond their rims. The boats were drawn onto a narrow shelf of sand, ropes pulled taut, supplies stacked carefully beyond the water's reach. There was little strength left for conversation. Each man moved with slow economy, performing the familiar tasks of camp with weary precision. Firewood was scarce, and what little they found burned quickly, its flames small, its smoke faint. Still, it was enough to boil a pot of coffee, enough to fry the last strips of bacon saved for the day. The men ate quietly, sitting close to the fire, their eyes half closed, their bodies slumped as if the canyon itself pressed down on them. They did not laugh much, nor argue. Weariness had smoothed the edges of their voices, leaving only murmurs. Yet amid the exhaustion, a different kind of beauty emerged. When the fire's light dimmed, the lanterns were lit, their soft glow casting halos on the sand and faint glimmers across the hulls of the boats. Against the immensity of the canyon, those lights looked impossibly small, fragile flames flickering within an ocean of stone and shadow. But their very smallness made them precious. The lanterns transformed the camp into a quiet sanctuary, a fragile haven carved out of the dark. Imagine yourself there now. You sit on cool sand, leaning against a half-empty flour sack, a blanket wrapped loosely around your shoulders. The lantern glows beside you, its light soft, golden, steady. Beyond its circle lies darkness, deep, absolute, pressing close. Yet that circle of light feels safe, as if it is all the world you need for the moment. You hear the steady breath of the river, flowing on as it always does, and the occasional hiss of firewood collapsing into ash. Every other sound has been swallowed by the canyon's vast silence. Powell sat a little apart, his lantern resting on a flat rock beside his notebook. His face was calm, his one hand moving steadily across the page as he recorded the day's progress, the height of the cliffs, the nature of the rocks, the behaviour of the current. But often his pen paused, and he would lift his eyes to the narrow strip of sky framed above. What he saw there held him longer than any word or measurement. The stars had gathered. In the openness of the plains they had seemed endless. But here, between canyon walls, they were magnified, concentrated into a ribbon of fire stretching from horizon to horizon. The Milky Way spilled across the sky like a luminous river, brighter than Powell had ever seen it back east. The canyon framed it as a cathedral frames stained glass. Narrow, tall, filled with brilliance. He wrote later that the heavens seemed a river of fire flowing above the river of water below. Picture it yourself now. You lie back on the sand, the blanket beneath you cold, the air cool against your skin. Above, only a narrow strip of sky is visible, but in that strip shines a universe. Stars blaze fiercely, undimmed by city or smoke, reflected faintly on the black water slipping past. It feels as though you're suspended between two rivers, one flowing beneath you, one flowing above, both carrying you toward eternity. The men noticed it too, though not with Powell's poetic eye. One pointed upward and muttered that the stars looked close enough to touch. Another joked that if they could gather starlight, they might finally have a ration that was not bacon or paste. The laughter was faint but real, an ember of warmth glowing among them. They soon fell quiet again, each man staring upward, lost in thoughts too private to share. The silence was no longer heavy but reverent, as though they all understood that they were witnessing something rare, something meant to be carried in memory forever. The lanterns flickered, their glow paling beside the brilliance of the stars. Powell closed his notebook at last, setting it carefully aside, and simply sat in stillness. He had seen much in his life, battlefields, loss, hardship. But here, in the depth of a canyon no map had dared to record, he felt the immensity of time and creation pressing gently upon him. He was not afraid of it. He welcomed it. Perhaps he thought of how small human quarrels seemed beside such vastness, how fleeting their laughter and their anger, and yet how precious. Close your eyes now and breathe slowly as Powell did. Imagine the river whispering beside you, steady and sure. Imagine the lantern's glow warming your face even as the night cools your skin. Imagine the stars above, sharp and countless, pouring their light into the canyon, into the water, into you. You're not apart from it, you are within it, part of the great stillness that has always been and will always be. The men slept early, exhaustion claiming them quickly. One by one they rolled into blankets, boots still on, hats pulled low, lanterns turned down until only faint glimmers remained. Soon even those lights went out, leaving only the stars and the fire of the heavens to illuminate the canyon. The river flowed on, carrying dreams as it carried boats, steady, eternal. Powell lingered the longest, lying back on the sand, his gaze still fixed upward. He must have felt, as you might feel now, that the canyon itself had become a cathedral, that he was not leading men down a river but leading them into a sanctuary carved by water and time. The thought eased him, and at last he closed his eyes, letting the river's voice carry him into sleep. The river had carried them far, deeper into the heart of the unknown, and each day it seemed to draw them tighter, together. By the time they made camp one evening on a sandy bank shaded by willows, there was little need for Powell's quiet reminders or hand signals. The crew moved almost instinctively, unloading provisions, pulling boats high onto the sand, securing ropes against the pull of the current. Their bodies were weary, but their routine was firm, a rhythm learned through trial and mistake. As the fire took hold, dry sticks crackling, sparks drifting upward into the dusk, the men settled around it, shoulders hunched, tin mugs of coffee warming their hands. The smell of bacon clung to their clothes, so constant now it was almost part of their own scent. But there was something different about this evening. Perhaps it was the relief of a calm day without rapids, or perhaps it was the memory of the starry cathedral of the night before. But their voices grew more open, their laughter easier, their stories longer. It began with one man, a wiry fellow with a scar along his jaw, who leaned back against a sack of flour and began to speak almost without prompting. He told of his boyhood in the rolling hills of Kentucky, of hunting rabbits with his father, of nights spent listening to his grandmother tell stories by the hearth. His voice carried a warmth not often heard in the harsh canyon air. The others listened, some nodding, some staring into the fire as though the flames themselves carried the images of his past. Another followed, a soldier who had marched across muddy fields during the war, who'd seen comrades fall and had lived to bury them. He did not linger on the details of battle. Instead, he spoke of the quiet afterward, the silence that settled when the guns ceased, a silence not unlike the one now pressing gently against the canyon walls. His voice wavered once, but he caught it, and the men respected his pause, letting the fire's crackle fill the gap before he continued. Then came lighter tales. One man recounted the time he tried to raise pigs on the frontier, only to discover that his neighbours had stronger appetites than his fences had strength. Another described a winter spent trapping beaver, when he awoke to find his cabin so snowed in that he had to climb out through the chimney. The firelight caught their faces as they laughed, shadows dancing along the cliff behind them. Powell listened more than he spoke. His role was not to dominate the circle, but to hold it together, to let each voice weave its own thread. He had his own stories, of Shiloh, of classrooms where he taught geology, of the one-armed determination that brought him here, but he sensed this was not his night to share. He sat with his notebook unopened, content to hear his men recall the lives they had left behind. Now, imagine yourself among them. You sit cross-legged on the sand, the warmth of the fire on your face, the cool air brushing your back. The voices rise and fall around you, each carrying a different cadence, a different memory, yet blending into one chorus of shared humanity. The canyon listens silently, the cliffs absorbing the sound as though storing it for another time. You sip the bitter coffee, chew the coarse bread, and feel the weight of weariness ease under the spell of stories. There was humour too, dry and cutting, born of hardship. One man, glancing at the ever-present bacon, swore that by the end of the voyage he would sprout a curly tail and begin rooting in the sand. Another complained that the flour had more time in the river than in the pan, and that someday they would open a bag to find fish had baked themselves in. The laughter was rough but hearty, filling the canyon with echoes more comforting than those of stone. Powell finally spoke, not with a story of his own, but with a reflection. He told them softly that every man carries more than supplies down a river. He carries his past, his regrets, his hopes. And in a canyon like this, stripped of the noise of towns and the distraction of farms, those things surface more clearly. He reminded them that the river, in its way, was shaping them just as it shaped the rocks, slowly, powerfully, leaving marks that would endure. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, and one by one the men fell silent, their stories finished, their eyes heavy. Some stretched out close to the coals, using sacks for pillows, their boots still on. Others leaned against the boats, the river's murmur lulling them towards sleep. The canyon loomed above, indifferent yet protective, as though it had seen countless such fires, countless circles of men trading stories under its watch. Close your eyes now and feel that same peace. Picture the glow of the fire fading, the taste of smoke lingering on your tongue, the warmth of laughter still echoing in your chest. The stories you heard were not grand histories or heroic epics. They were fragments of lives, small yet precious, pieces of humanity carried into the wilderness. And in that wilderness, those fragments glowed as bright as any lantern. The last embers dimmed. The canyon fell silent again, save for the steady current of the river. Powell remained awake a little longer, gazing at his men, each now a shadow wrapped in blanket and fatigue. He must have known that their stories, like the canyon, would stay with him, shaping his memory long after the voyage ended. He turned his gaze upward once more to the narrow slice of stars, and then closed his eyes, letting the river sing him to rest. There are nights when the fire burns low, and the voices fade, when even the canyon seems to lean closer, listening for one last word before silence takes its place. On such nights, Powell often remained awake after the others had surrendered to sleep. He would sit quietly, lantern at his side, notebook open on his knee, his pen scratching faintly in the hush. The glow cast soft lines across his face, deepening the hollows of his cheeks, highlighting the firm set of his jaw. To watch him then was to see not only the leader of an expedition, but a man sustained by an inner flame, one that no rapid, no shadowed canyon, no missing arm could extinguish. His presence had become the steady axes around which the others turned. Some of the men had stronger muscles, others quicker reflexes, but it was Powell's resolve that held them together, a calmness that steadied their oars even when the river roared. He never raised his voice unnecessarily. Commands came soft, deliberate, measured. A lifted hand, a brief nod, a glance toward a dangerous current. These gestures spoke with more authority than any shout. And the men, weary as they were, trusted him. They may have grumbled at rations, cursed at soaked flour, quarrelled among themselves, but when Powell spoke, they listened. It was not only his authority that commanded respect, but the quiet bravery of his own labour. Despite the absence of his right arm, lost years earlier on the battlefield at Shiloh, Powell rowed when needed, steered when required, and carried his share of the burden without complaint. He gripped the oar with his left hand, bracing himself with his body, guiding the boat through currents that would have unsettled stronger men with both arms intact. There was no boasting in it, no display meant to inspire. He simply did what had to be done, and the sight of it inspired the crew more than any speech could have. Imagine yourself in the boat with him. The river surges, the cliffs loom, the current presses hard. Powell's sleeve, pinned neatly at the shoulder, hangs empty, yet his one hand holds the tiller steady, his gaze fixed forward. The boat quivers, shudders, then steadies under his control. You feel the surge of confidence that flows not from shouted orders, but from the calm presence of a man who refuses to yield. His resolve extended beyond the physical. He carried with him an unshakable devotion to recording, to preserving in words and sketches the story of the land they were moving through. While others grumbled about damp clothes and spoiled bacon, Powell worried about his notebooks, keeping them wrapped in oilskin, shielding them from spray, drying them by the fire when necessary. To him, the journey was more than survival. It was discovery, and discovery meant memory. The canyon was not only to be endured, but to be understood, and that understanding would outlast their hunger and fatigue. The men sometimes teased him for his endless scribbling, calling his journals heavier than their barrels of flour. Yet they respected it too, sensing that his careful notes gave their struggle a purpose greater than themselves. Without Powell, they were men in boats, rowing into danger for no clear reason. With him, they were explorers, writing the first lines of a story that would stretch beyond their own lives. At night, by lantern light, Powell's pen moved steadily, capturing not only the strata of the cliffs, but the moods of the river, the colours of the stone, the silence of the canyons. He wrote of the stars framed by black walls, of echoes that seemed like voices of the past, of rapids that thundered like cavalry charges. His words were not dry records, they were living impressions filled with awe, and though the men did not always understand his science, they understood his reverence, and that reverence shaped their own. Pause now and imagine Powell by his lantern, the canyon vast and dark around him, the men asleep nearby, the river whispering just beyond. His handwriting curves across the page, each line a tether binding the fleeting present to the permanence of memory. You watch the lantern glow reflected in his eyes, and you sense the weight of his determination. He is not writing for himself alone, but for all who will come after, for those who will never see these waters but will know of them through his words. During the days, his resolve was tested often. Rapids loomed without warning, the roar reaching them long before the sight. Boats were battered against rocks, oars snapped, provisions lost. Each time the men looked to Powell, his sleeve hung empty, his voice remained steady, and somehow they made it through. At night, when tempers flared and weariness threatened to splinter them, he guided them gently back to balance, not by denying the hardship, but by acknowledging it, sharing it, never asking of them what he did not give himself. The river shaped stone over millennia, carving canyons deeper than cathedrals, but in these weeks it shaped men too, and Powell most of all. He bore the weight of leadership with the same quiet endurance with which he bore his missing arm, not as a mark of limitation, but as a reminder of what strength truly means. His resolve was not loud, not dramatic, but steady as the current that pulled them ever forward. Close your eyes now and place yourself beside him. The fires burned low, the lantern glows faintly. You hear the river in the distance, steady and sure. Powell sits quietly, pen moving, gaze occasionally lifting to the stars. His presence calms you, not because he promises safety, but because he embodies perseverance. You know the days ahead will be difficult, but you also know that with him at the helm, the river will not break you. One by one, the men surrender to sleep, their snores mingling with the river's murmur. Powell finally closed his notebook, wrapped it carefully and set it aside. He gazed upward once more, letting the narrow strip of starlight steady him. Then, with the same quiet composure that marked his every action, he lay down, pulling his blanket close, and trusted the river to carry them all toward morning. By the time they entered another stretch of narrow gorge, the men were weary in ways that no single night's sleep could undo. Their hands were raw from rowing, their clothes stiff with salt from repeated soakings, their stomachs tired of bacon and paste. Even laughter, once an easy refuge, came more, rarely now, as though it too had grown waterlogged and heavy. They rode in silence, the canyon towering above them, its walls so close that their oars nearly brushed the stone. The river here ran smoother than in Desolation, but the calm felt deceptive, like a held breath. Every bend might conceal another cataract, every rumble might signal disaster. The men glanced often toward the horizon of stone, searching for signs of turbulence. Their nerves grew tight, and tight nerves, when given too little food and too much silence, have a way of turning inward. It began quietly, with mutters passed from one boat to another during short rests on gravel bars. A man would remark that they had already come far enough, that no map could be worth the risk of drowning or starvation. Another would answer that Powell himself could not row forever with one arm, that his notebooks might prove more burden than treasure. These words were spoken softly, but the canyon, so generous with echoes before, gave them no return. The silence seemed to swallow the whispers, leaving them to hang in the air, heavy and unresolved. Imagine sitting near the fire that evening, the canyon pressing close, the stars framed narrowly overhead. The men huddled around the flames, their faces half lit, their eyes shadowed. They spoke little, but when they did, their words carried an edge. One complained of damp flour, another cursed the endless bacon. Someone suggested, half joking, that the river seemed determined to kill them and might yet succeed. The laughter that followed was brittle, breaking quickly into silence again. Powell heard these things, though no man said them directly to him. He was not blind to their fatigue, nor deaf to their frustration. But he chose not to answer at once. He let the murmurs pass, as the river let driftwood pass, knowing that some things dissolve on their own if not forced. His calmness was a kind of reply, though it left room for unease to grow in the shadows. The canyon itself seemed to take sides. By day it swallowed their voices, giving back no echo. By night it towered silently, the walls black and immense, turning every whisper into something sharper. Men lay awake in their blankets, listening to the river's steady voice, but also to the sound of others shifting restlessly, sighing, muttering half-formed thoughts into the dark. The silence magnified everything. Doubts felt larger, hopes felt smaller. Now pause and imagine the weight of that silence. You lie on the sand, the fire nearly out, only a few embers glowing faintly. The river hums nearby, steady but indifferent. Around you the men breathe heavily, but you sense that few are asleep. You hear a whispered question, "How much farther?" And another whispered answer, "Too far." The canyon gives nothing back, and the silence presses down like stone. During the day, tempers flickered. A rope slipped, a barrel shifted, a boat struck a rock with a hollow crack. Voices rose sharply, blame tossed, quickly, anger flaring brighter than the fire ever did. But just as quickly the anger subsided, replaced by the weary realization that quarrelling solved nothing. A joke might follow, rough and clumsy, but enough to ease the air again. Still, the seeds of doubt had been planted, and seeds in silence can grow quickly. Powell continued to write in his notebooks, to measure distances with his instruments, to sketch the canyon walls with steady lines. To him, the journey was a thread woven not only of hardship but of discovery, and discovery demanded perseverance. He did not deny the dangers, he acknowledged them. But he believed that the river could be endured, that its story could be told, and that his men would see their hardships redeemed by memory. His resolve, quiet as ever, stood in sharp contrast to the whispers that curled around the fire. The wow moment of these nights was not a vision of stars or flames, but the contrast itself. The vast canyon holding its breath while human voices trembled within it. The silence of stone against the smallness of doubt made the men's whispers sound fragile, almost ghostly. as though they were speaking not only to one another but to the canyon itself. And the canyon's reply was nothing at all. Imagine now that you are part of that scene. The fire has burned to ash, the lanterns extinguished. The sky above is a narrow river of stars, cold and brilliant, framed by black walls. You listen to the murmurs of men beside you, fears half spoken, hopes half abandoned. You feel the immense canyon pressing in, vast and eternal, and you sense how small your doubts are, yet how heavy they feel when magnified by silence. You breathe slowly, letting the river's steady voice remind you that movement continues, that forward is the only direction possible. By morning, the men rose again, shoulders stiff, eyes tired, but hands still reaching for the oars. They may have whispered of quitting, of turning back, but when the river pulled, they followed. The silence had not broken them, though it had left its mark. Powell gathered his notebooks, wrapped them carefully, and climbed into his boat with the same calm composure as always. His presence remained the answer he did not speak aloud. The current caught them once more, tugging them deeper into the labyrinth. The canyon walls rose, the river murmured, and the whispers faded behind the splash of oars. For now at least, doubt had to give way to the steady insistence of the river. The river wound on, its voice steady, guiding the boats deeper into stone corridors that seemed older than memory. Days had passed since the first quarrels, and though the men still grumbled over rations or splashed curses at cold water, a quiet reverence had begun to creep into their mood. The canyon was no longer just an obstacle, it had become a presence, a vast companion whose silence demanded respect. One evening, after the boats had been hauled onto a strip of sand and the fire coaxed to life, Powell wandered beyond the camp. His lantern cast a small, trembling circle of light against the canyon wall. The cliffs rose sheer and immense, but here, at shoulder height, the surface bore markings, lines, spirals, shapes, etched deep into the stone. He called the others over, his voice low but urgent, and together they gathered around, their fire forgotten for a moment, eyes fixed on the ancient carvings. The petroglyphs glowed in the lantern's flicker, shadows moving across them like living spirits. Some were simple, spirals curling inward, circles with radiating lines. Others suggested figures, men with outstretched arms, animals with horns, patterns that hinted at stories but withheld their endings. The men stood silently, as if afraid to disturb the figures with careless laughter. For once, even their hunger and fatigue slipped away, replaced by wonder. Imagine yourself standing there with them. The night is cool, the lantern warm in your hand, the fire's crackle fades behind you, and all that remains is the glow on the rock, revealing marks older than any nation, older than Powell's maps, older even than the names of rivers. You reach out, your fingers brushing lightly across the grooves, and you feel the texture of time itself, rough, deliberate, enduring. Powell spoke softly, telling them these were signs left by people who had lived here long before their descent. Tribes whose names he only partly knew had called the canyon home, finding food along its banks, shelter in its alcoves, meaning in its silence. These carvings were their voices, etched in stone rather than carried by echo. Spirals might mark journeys or seasons or visions seen in dreams. Figures might tell of hunts or spirits or ancestors. No one could be certain, but their presence was undeniable. Others had been here, listening to the same river, staring at the same stars. The men listened, their usual skepticism quiet. One muttered that the spirals looked like snakes curling through the rock. Another said they reminded him of suns rising over hills. A third whispered that perhaps they were maps, guiding the way through the labyrinth of stone. No answer came, but the canyon itself seemed to lean closer, its silence thick with meaning. The fire popped behind them, sparks leaping into the night, but no one turned back immediately. They remained gathered at the wall, staring as if the figures might shift or reveal more in the shifting glow. Their shadows stretched across the rock, mingling with the carved shapes so that for a moment it seemed the past and the present had joined. Living men standing beside the marks of those long gone, all of them companions within the same canyon. Close your eyes now and picture the scene more vividly. You see hands, not your own, holding stone tools, chipping carefully at the surface. You hear the faint scrape, the rhythm of effort, the murmur of voices carried on canyon wind. Fire flickers nearby, casting light across freshly carved spirals. Those hands pull away, satisfied, leaving behind a message meant not for one night but for centuries. Then the vision fades, and you stand again with Powell and his men, your lantern's glow falling on marks already old before any of you were born. When they returned to the fire, the men were quieter than usual. Bacon still sizzled in the pan, coffee still brewed in its dented pot, but their voices carried a softer edge, as though they had been humbled by the discovery. One joked gently that if the flour spoiled again, they might at least leave their own marks on the canyon, scribbling warnings for any fool who tried the river next. The laughter that followed was light, respectful, not rowdy. It seemed even their humour had bent to the canyon's gravity. Powell wrote quickly in his notebook, his words illuminated by the lantern beside him. He described the figures as best he could, noting their patterns, their locations, their strange allure. But what filled his eyes more than his pen was the sense of continuity, that this river, which seemed so wild and empty, had long carried human voices along its banks. They were not the first to sit by these fires, nor would they be the last. The canyon was not just stone, it was memory. The night deepened. Stars revealed themselves in their narrow frame above, shimmering cold and bright, but the carving seemed warmer, more immediate. The men lay down at last, some still glancing toward the canyon wall, as though expecting the figures to glow on their own. The fire died to embers, the lanterns dimmed, but the petroglyphs remained, etched into memory as firmly as into stone. And as you lie back with them, blanket pulled close against the chill, imagine the spirals glowing faintly in the dark, like secret constellations carved not in sky, but in rock. Picture hands reaching across centuries, leaving behind signs that you now behold. The river flows, the fire fades, but the stone remembers. You're part of that remembering, one more presence carried into the silence of the canyon. The canyon is never still for long. One evening, as the crew prepared their camp on a gravel bar beneath looming cliffs, the sky began to change. It had been clear all day, the sun burning through thin air, shadows sharp against the rock. But now, as the fire was coaxed into flame and bacon laid across the pan, clouds gathered above the canyon rim. At first, they were only smudges of grey against the fading light, drifting like scraps of smoke. Soon, however, they thickened, rolling together into a dark ceiling that pressed heavily over the narrow strip of sky. The men noticed it quickly. They looked up between bites of their coarse meal, muttering that the air felt heavier, that the breeze carried a strange dampness. Powell, quiet as always, observed without alarm. Storms came and went, he reminded them. The canyon had withstood countless tempests, and they would withstand one more. But as the firelight flickered against the stone, the men felt an unease creep into their bones. Storms on open plains were one thing, storms in narrow canyons another. The first roll of thunder came low and distant, a vibration that trembled faintly in the ground beneath their boots. It echoed off the cliffs, bouncing back in overlapping waves until it seemed that drums were being struck from every direction. The men fell silent, listening. Another roll followed, closer now, louder, shaking the air so deeply that it seemed the stone itself groaned in reply. Rain began as a whisper, a few drops hissing against the fire, a patter on canvas and cloth. Then the whisper became a murmur, then a drumbeat. The fire sputtered, smoke stinging their eyes as the rain fell harder, soaking hair, jackets and blankets. The men scrambled to cover provisions with tarps, to pull canvas over their bedding, to drag flour barrels further from the river's edge. Boots splashed, ropes tightened, voices rose sharply and then were drowned in the downpour. Imagine yourself there now. You stand in the midst of it, rain cascading down, soaking through your coat until it clings heavy to your skin. The fire has shrunk to embers, steam rising as raindrops strike it. The river, once steady, now roars louder, swelled by sudden torrents feeding from unseen gullies. Above, the canyon walls vanish into blackness, their shapes revealed only when lightning tears across the sky. The lightning was the true spectacle. It came without warning, jagged spears of white light that split the sky and illuminated the canyon in terrible glory. For a heartbeat, the cliffs stood revealed in their full height, soaring higher than cathedrals, their faces carved by millennia of storms. Then darkness crashed back, heavier than before. The image burned into the men's eyes. Thunder followed each strike with a violence that shook their very bones, rolling down the gorge like the charge of unseen cavalry. One man cursed that the storm meant to crush them where rapids had failed. Another laughed, though the laugh was thin, declaring that at least the bacon would be washed clean for once. The humour cracked the tension slightly, but the storm gave no mercy. Canvas whipped in the wind, ropes groaned, and the men huddled close to what little shelter they could create. Powell, lantern clutched in his one hand, moved steadily among them. He checked the lashings on the boats, tightened coverings over the precious notebooks, reassured the men with a calmness that seemed almost defiant against the thunder. His presence was small against the immensity of the storm, yet it carried weight. He reminded them that storms pass, that water rises but also falls, that the canyon itself had endured and so could they. His voice was nearly drowned by the thunder, but his calm steadied them more than the words themselves. Close your eyes and picture it clearly. A flash of lightning reveals the canyon. Walls, smooth and sheer, stretching into heights you cannot measure. The cliffs glow white for an instant, then vanish back into darkness. The rain lashes down, cold and relentless, soaking every thread of cloth, dripping from hair, pooling at your boots. Around you the men crouch together, eyes wide, breath misting in the cold air. The thunder cracks again, louder, deeper, rolling until it feels as though the canyon itself has become an organ pipe sounding its endless note. And then, as all storms do, it began to fade. The thunder grew more distant, the lightning less frequent, the rain softer, more like a sigh than a deluge. The men emerged slowly from their shelters, dripping and weary, their faces drawn but relieved. The fire was gone, drowned beneath the downpour, but embers glowed faintly, stubborn against the dark. The river still murmured beside them, swollen and restless but steady. They set about the business of drying what they could, laying damp blankets across rocks, wringing water from sleeves. The flour, predictably, had suffered again, its topmost sack soaked into paste. Jokes followed, half-hearted but genuine, that perhaps the river itself was determined to turn them all into bakers. Laughter rose, not triumphant but grateful, a reminder that humour was their shield against despair. Powell recorded the storm in his notebook by the dim light of his lantern. His words were brief but vivid, describing lightning that revealed walls higher than any cathedral, a fleeting glimpse of eternity carved in stone. He seemed less troubled by the wet and the cold than moved by the grandeur of what they had seen. For him, the storm was not only a trial but a revelation, a reminder of the canyon's immensity and the fragility of human effort within it. Later, when the men lay down, blankets still damp, boots still wet, they listened to the canyon settling after the storm. Water dripped from unseen ledges, small rivulets trickled into the river, and the cliffs stood silent once more, as though nothing had happened. The stars began to appear again in their narrow frame above, faint behind lingering clouds. The river flowed on, indifferent yet eternal, carrying them deeper into its labyrinth. Now imagine yourself lying there with them, your body heavy with exhaustion, your clothes still damp, but your eyes lifted toward the stars returning slowly overhead. The thunder has passed, but the memory of lightning remains. Walls higher than cathedrals, revealed for a moment, then hidden again. You breathe deeply, letting the hush of the river replace the roar, letting sleep take you as surely as the current takes the boats. After the storm passed, the canyon seemed to breathe more quietly. The air was washed clean, cool against the skin, and the river, though swollen, had regained its steady voice. The men, weary from a night of thunder and dripping blankets, found some relief in the morning sun. It poured down in long shafts between the cliffs, warming their shoulders, drying their boots, softening the stiffness in their bones. The boats were loaded again, supplies checked, ropes tightened, oars braced. The current, strong from the rains, carried them swiftly, as though eager to erase the memory of the night before. The men rowed with renewed rhythm, water flashing silver from their blades, spray cooling their faces. Yet Powell's gaze was less on the water than on the walls towering above them. He pointed now and then, his voice low but intent, guiding their eyes toward features they might otherwise have missed. High on the cliffs, far above their heads, the stone bore marks not of men, but of oceans long vanished. Embedded in the red and grey bands were shapes that seemed almost delicate against the immensity of rock. Shells, corals, the imprints of creatures that once lived and died in waters that had covered this desert eons ago. Powell's eyes gleamed as he described them, his voice carrying both the precision of science and the reverence of wonder. The men craned their necks, squinting upward. Some saw only faint lines and curves pale against the stone, but others, after a moment, recognized the patterns. Shells layered in strata hundreds of feet above the river, fossils suspended like ornaments in cathedral walls. They stared in silence, not with the clarity of geologists, but with the awe of men confronted by time itself. Imagine looking up with them. The cliffs tower so high, you feel your neck ache as you search their faces. There, in the sunlit band of limestone, you see a faint spiral, unmistakably a shell. Another step higher, a cluster of shapes like flowers pressed into stone. You realize that where you now float, once waves had rolled, and fish had swum, and coral had bloomed in clear waters. You are drifting not through desert, but through the ghost of an ancient sea. Powell explained softly that the land had lifted and shifted over ages, seas retreating, rivers calving, mountains rising. Each layer told of a world transformed, stacked patiently by time. To him, the canyon was a library, each stratum a page, each fossil a letter in a script older than language. He ran his hand along the side of the boat as if to steady himself against the immensity of it, and the men, even those who joked most often, fell quiet. They landed at midday on a ledge where the river slowed, and Powell climbed a short distance up the slope, notebook in hand, to sketch the formations more closely. His boots slipped on loose stone, his empty sleeve swinging at his side, but he moved with determination. He paused beneath a wall streaked with fossils, lantern held close though daylight was enough, tracing the shapes with his eyes, committing them to memory as much as to paper. Below, the men rested, chewing dry bread, sipping the bitter coffee that had survived yet another soaking. One muttered that Powell could fill 100 notebooks and still the rocks would keep, more secrets than he could ever write down. Another replied that perhaps the rocks wanted someone stubborn enough to try. Their laughter was soft, edged with respect. Close your eyes now and imagine the canyon as it once was. Not cliffs, not desert, not silence, but a vast ocean rolling under sunlight, waves breaking against shores long since buried. Picture fish darting where now ravens circle, coral blooming where now sand lies dry, shells settling into seabeds that would someday rise to tower over rivers. The air is salt, the water endless, and the canyon walls around you are not yet walls but currents, tides, rhythms of a sea that believed itself eternal. Then the vision fades, and you return to the narrow gorge, the fossils still clinging stubbornly to stone, silent witnesses of time's long transformation. As they pushed off again, the men could not help glancing upward more often, their eyes scanning the bands of rock for signs of other ancient lives. The river carried them steadily, the oars dipped and rose, but their thoughts wandered to seas and creatures they would never see. For a moment their hunger, their damp clothes, even their fear of rapids seemed smaller, set against the vastness of ages pressed into stone above them. That night when they camped, the firelight reflected faintly on the cliffs, illuminating fossils still visible even in the dark. The men sat quietly, their voices lower, their humour subdued. One finally broke the hush, saying that if seas had once covered these canyons, then perhaps someday rivers would cover their own graves, and someone else would look down at them as fossils of a vanished world. The laughter that followed was uneasy but genuine, a reminder that even awe could be softened by human wit. Powell wrote long into the night, his lantern flickering against the canyon wall. He described the fossils, the strata, the sense of time pressing from every side. But beneath the facts, his words carried something deeper, a reverence for the continuity of life, the reminder that even in desolation the earth was never empty. It had always been alive, and always would be. You lie back on the cool sand now, your eyes drifting upward toward the cliff faces. The fire crackles faintly, the river murmurs nearby, but your imagination lingers with those seas. You see the shells embedded above you, fossils gleaming faintly in lantern light, and you feel the presence of an ocean long vanished yet still here, written in stone. The canyon becomes less a place of silence, and more a place of voices, millions of them, pressed into rock and waiting to be heard. The river is never truly predictable. One morning, after a night spent beneath cliffs streaked with fossils, the men launched their boats into water that at first appeared calm. The surface gleamed like polished glass, broken only by faint ripples. Yet within minutes the current shifted, pulling hard against the hulls, sweeping them into waves that leapt suddenly out of nowhere. Oars splashed, shouts rang out, and spray rose high enough to drench faces and soak provisions stacked under canvas. By the time they reached calmer water, they were wet to the bone, their clothes heavy, their shoulders aching. Worse still, one of the flour sacks had burst open in the turmoil. White paste spread across the bottom of a boat, coating planks and boots alike, so that when the men finally dragged the vessel onto a gravel bar, it looked as though they had been rowing through porridge. At first there was frustration, sharp curses, weary groans, complaints about ruined rations. But then one man, squatting beside the sodden mess, scooped up a handful, held it dripping above his head, and announced that the river had decided it wanted pancakes more than they did. The laughter that followed was loud enough to startle birds from a ledge. Even Powell allowed himself a brief chuckle, his stern composure softened by the absurdity of it all. Imagine the scene more closely. The boat sits tilted on the sand, its planks smeared white, ropes trailing like strands of dough. The men, still wet from the spray, lean on their oars, grinning despite their exhaustion. Their boots squelch with every step, leaving sticky tracks across the shore. The canyon tower silent above, indifferent to their plight, but the sound of their laughter fills the space, bouncing faintly before being swallowed by stone. It was not the first time provisions had been lost, nor would it be the last. Bacon went rancid quickly in the heat. Coffee spilled into the river. Small tools vanished in swirling eddies. Yet each loss, after the initial anger, often turned into the seed of a joke, a way of carrying the weight together. They carved humour out of hardship the way the river carved canyons from rock, slowly, persistently, until the sharp edges softened. That afternoon, while resting on a sandy shelf, one of the younger men picked up a piece of driftwood and began carving with his knife. He etched his initials into it, then passed it to another who did the same. Soon the wood was covered with letters and marks, each man adding his claim, as if leaving behind proof that they had survived at least this far. Someone suggested tossing it into the river, letting the current carry their signatures downstream to whatever lay ahead. Another insisted it should be wedged into a crack in the canyon wall, a message for the next travellers foolhardy enough to follow their path. They debated cheerfully, the object of their debate less important than the laughter it inspired. Powell watched quietly, his pen resting for once. He understood the necessity of these moments. The canyon was vast, the dangers real, but men needed levity as much as bread. Humour was a kind of rations too, something that sustained them when bacon soured and flour failed. Without it, despair would spread faster than hunger. Now pause and picture yourself with them. You sit, cross-legged on the warm sand, the carved driftwood resting across your knees. You run your fingers over the letters, each cut sharp and deliberate, each groove a declaration of presence. Around you, the men laugh, their voices lighter than they have been for days. The fire crackles nearby, and the smell of smoke mixes with the faint sweetness of damp flour drying in the sun. For a moment, the hardship feels far away, as though the canyon itself has granted a reprieve. That evening, after supper of what remained edible, the driftwood was tossed into the river at last. The men watched as the current caught it, spinning it once before pulling it swiftly out of sight. One joked that it would surely reach the ocean before they did. Another replied that perhaps it would grow into a tree again, sprouting leaves from their initials, a forest planted by laughter. The canyon gave no answer, but the river carried the wood onward as it carried everything. As darkness settled, the men lay back on their blankets, bellies not quite full but spirits lighter. They spoke idly of home, of farms, of families, of warm kitchens where meals did not need to be fought from a reluctant fire. The stories wandered, some wistful, some absurd, but all softened by the rhythm of humour. One man swore that when he returned east, he would open a bakery and sell only waterlogged bread, advertising it as authentic river fare. Another declared that if anyone ever asked how he survived the canyon, he would say simply that he had become half flour himself, a man held together by dough and bacon grease. The laughter rose again, rough but genuine, before fading into the quiet murmur of the river. Above them the stars spread wide, cold and brilliant, framed by cliffs now darkened into silhouettes. The canyon seemed to hold them gently in its vast hands, allowing their small mirth to echo once before sinking back into silence. Powell, before turning down his lantern, recorded the day's mishaps with the same care he gave to strata and fossils. He wrote of the soaked flour, of the driftwood marked with initials, of the jokes that carried the men through. His words carried no complaint, only the recognition that hardship and humour often travel side by side. To him, these small stories mattered as much as the great rapids or the towering cliffs. They revealed the spirit of the men, the way laughter shaped survival. Close your eyes now. Picture the river, dark and steady, carrying driftwood carved with names into the night. Picture the men, stretched out in weary comfort, their faces softened by laughter. Picture the canyon, vast and indifferent, yet allowing this moment of levity to glow like a small fire within its silence. You feel the same warmth, the same release, as though the hardships of your own day have been softened by shared laughter. The river flows, the stars shine, and you drift gently toward rest. The canyon, which had allowed laughter and lightness to survive for a time, soon reminded the men of its true power. The morning began deceptively calm. The sky was clear, pale blue between high walls of stone, the river moving with steady rhythm, the boats gliding easily along its current. The men rowed in silence, shoulders aching but spirits buoyed by the memory of laughter around the fire the night before. Yet as the day lengthened, a new sound began to creep into the air. A low murmur, faint at first, then growing, a vibration that seemed to come not only from the water ahead but from the stone itself. At first they thought it might be wind moving through unseen gullies, but soon the murmur swelled into a steady roar. Each stroke of the oars drew them closer, and with every bend the sound deepened, louder, heavier, until it drowned their own voices. The canyon narrowed abruptly, its walls leaning inward as though conspiring to squeeze the river into fury. The water grew restless, flecked with foam, curling and twisting on itself. The men exchanged glances, their jaws set, their eyes narrowing. They knew what waited ahead. Cataracts, the kind that had already been whispered about, half in dread, half in awe. Powell raised his hand, his lantern jaw firm, and signalled the boats toward shore. They scrambled onto rocks, boots slipping on wet stone, and clambered forward to scout the river's path. What they saw made even the most seasoned among them catch his breath. The river, swollen and fierce, plunged over a series of drops, each wave rising high enough to engulf a boat whole. White spray leapt into the air, curling like smoke from a battlefield, mist veiling the cliffs and shifting curtains. The thunder of water filled the canyon, so loud it seemed to rattle the bones of those who stood on the rocks. Powell studied it carefully, his eyes moving from one eddy to another, gauging currents, noting boulders that jutted like fangs. His men muttered, some suggesting they portage around, dragging the boats across jagged rocks, a task that could take days. Others argued that no portage could carry their heavy vessels far enough, that the only way forward was through. Powell, calm as ever, listened to them all, then made his decision. They would run the cataracts. The men returned to their boats, hearts pounding. Ropes were checked again, lashings tightened, supplies bound more firmly than ever. Oars were gripped with white knuckles. The roar ahead seemed to grow with every passing second, filling their ears until they could scarcely hear their own thoughts. And then, with no more words to be said, they pushed off, one boat after another, into the chaos. Imagine yourself in one of those boats now. The current seizes you the instant you leave shore, pulling you faster than your oar can resist. The bow dips suddenly, spray drenching your face cold as ice. The stern lifts, then crashes down, the whole boat shuddering with the impact. Ahead lies a wall of water, rising and curling like a living thing, white and furious. You lean into the oar, muscles straining, trying to keep the boat's nose forward. The roar fills your skull, deafening, relentless. The first boat plunged, vanished in spray, then reappeared, bucking wildly but still afloat. The second followed, struck broadside by a wave that nearly toppled it, only to right itself at the last moment with a desperate thrust of the oars. Powell's boat came third, steady under his one hand, his voice calm though nearly lost in the thunder. He guided it with precision, weaving between boulders, steering into waves rather than away, using the river's own strength to carry them through. Men shouted, but their voices were drowned instantly. One lost his hat, another his grip on an oar, but still the boats pressed forward. Water poured over the sides, soaking provisions, threatening to swamp the hulls. For an instant it seemed certain they would be lost. Then, with a final surge, the current thrust them into a broad pool below, calmer though still churning, the roar echoing above like distant thunder. They emerged drenched, gasping, eyes wide. The boats were battered, their planks groaning, but none destroyed. Supplies were soaked, yet most remained. The men, shaking with exhaustion, let their oars rest across their laps, staring back at the maelstrom they had survived. Then laughter broke out. Not light laughter this time, but deep, breathless, almost delirious. They had faced chaos and endured, and the relief poured from them in rough voices that mingled with the river's fading roar. Powell, calm as ever, noted the event in his journal with simple words. We run a long series of cataracts and come through, drenched but safe. Yet his eyes betrayed more than his words, glimmering with pride at the strength of his crew and the endurance of their fragile boats. He knew there would be more, that greater danger still lay ahead, but he also knew that each rapid survived bound them tighter together. On shore, they pulled the boats up, inspected them for damage, wrung water from their sleeves. Bacon and Flour had once again suffered, drawing groans and jokes in equal measure. One man swore the river had a taste for flour and would not rest until it had eaten its fill. Another replied that perhaps the river hoped to open a bakery at the canyon's end. Their laughter, though hoarse, filled the narrow gorge, echoing briefly before being lost in the immensity of stone. That night, their camp was quiet but content. The fire burned low, smoke curling into the sky, the men stretched out in weary triumph. The roar of the cataracts still rang faintly in their ears, yet the calm pool nearby whispered gently, as though promising rest. Above, the stars glittered faintly through a veil of lingering mist, a reminder of how small their trial had been against the immensity of the universe. Close your eyes now and place yourself with them. You lie on damp sand, the fire's glow warming your face, your muscles aching from effort. In your ears still lingers the roar of water, relentless and thunderous, but also the sound of your own laughter, raw and alive. The canyon holds both, the fury of cataracts, the relief of survival, and you, like Powell and his men, are carried onward, deeper into the labyrinth of stone and silence. After the fury of the cataracts, the canyon seemed to pause, as though exhausted by its own performance. The roar faded behind them, replaced by a steady hush. The river widened, its surface smoothing into long, dark ribbons that carried the boats gently, almost apologetically. The cliffs, which had thundered with echoes of water, now stood silent, their faces pale in the evening light. The men rowed softly, their strokes less urgent, as if afraid to disturb the stillness that had descended. They found a sandy bar at dusk and pulled the boats ashore. The air was cool, washed clean by spray, scented faintly of wet stone. The men moved slowly, their muscles stiff from the day's struggle, but their voices carried less strain than before. There was relief in their tone, the relief of men who had faced chaos and lived to feel calm again. Provisions were stacked carefully, a fire was coaxed into being, and coffee brewed in its battered pot. The bacon, though damp, sputtered bravely in the pan, its smell mingling with smoke to create a comfort that felt almost luxurious after the thunder of rapids. As they ate, conversation dwindled, not from weariness alone, but from the weight of the silence that wrapped around them. It was not an empty silence, but a full one, the kind that hums softly in your bones, that makes every crackle of firewood, every shift of boots in the sand sound louder than it should. The canyon seemed to be holding its breath, watching, waiting. Powell sensed it as well. He sat by his lantern, notebook unopened, his gaze fixed not on his men but on the river itself. The water slid past in soft ripples, reflecting the first stars pricking through the narrow band of sky. The cliffs rose black on either side, their outlines sharp against fading twilight. For once he did not measure or describe, he simply listened. Imagine sitting with him there. You lean back on the sand, the fire's warmth at your feet, the cool air brushing your face. The river murmurs softly, a lullaby compared to the roar of the cataracts. The canyon above looms vast and dark, yet it does not threaten. It enfolds you instead, a shelter of stone and shadow. Around you, the men sit quietly, some sipping the last of their coffee. others staring into the flames. No one feels the need to fill the air with words. The night deepened. The fire burned low, reduced to glowing coals. The lanterns cast small halos, their light paling beside the brilliance of stars above. Through the narrow slit of sky, the heavens revealed themselves with startling clarity, more numerous than the men had ever seen in towns or farms. Constellations stretched like rivers of a light, reflected faintly on the dark water below. It felt as though the canyon had opened a window into eternity, a reminder that silence itself can speak. Powell finally opened his notebook and wrote only a few words. The night calm after storm, the river hushed, the men hushed, as if all the world had stopped to listen. His handwriting was slower than usual, his lines fewer. The silence had entered even his journal, making brevity feel more fitting than detail. The men lay down one by one, rolling into damp blankets, boots still on. Their snores soon rose faintly, blending with the river's steady whisper. Yet the silence remained, larger than their sleep, larger than their fire, larger than their laughter. It was a silence that seemed to stretch beyond them, into the stone, into the stars, into the memory of the river itself. Close your eyes now and imagine it fully. The fire is almost gone, only red embers glowing faintly. The river slides past, smooth and dark, its voice a gentle hum. The canyon looms high, black walls against a sky alive with stars. You lie still, feeling the hush settle over your body, your thoughts, even your heartbeat. It is not emptiness, it is fullness, as if the canyon has pressed pause on time itself. You feel suspended between water and sky, held tenderly by silence. The long silence lasted through the night, unbroken even by wind. No coyotes called, no owls cried, only the river moved, steady and sure. Powell, lying wakeful for a time, must have felt it too. The rare gift of a canyon holding still, as though granting permission to rest. He finally closed his eyes, his face calm, and allowed the silence to carry him into dreams. When dawn came, it arrived gently, almost reluctantly, the first light slipping down the walls in pale ribbons. The silence lifted slowly, replaced by the faint stirrings of men waking, stretching, pulling boots onto stiff feet. The river greeted them with its steady murmur, unchanged, eternal. The long silence was over, but its memory lingered, like a note still vibrating long after the string has been plucked. The canyon carried them further still, its walls higher, its bends sharper, its rapids fiercer. The men had grown lean from hardship, their clothes threadbare, their faces lined with exhaustion. Bacon remained their most faithful companion, though it now tasted more of rancid grease than comfort. Flour had spoiled so many times it had become a joke worn thin, and the coffee was often more river water than bean. Yet hunger was not the worst of it. It was the constant battle with the river, the way it demanded attention at every bend, the way it punished hesitation, the way it pressed into their bones the reminder that they were small and fragile. By late August, their supplies dwindling, their boats battered, and their nerves worn raw, the party entered a gorge more ominous than any before. The cliffs rose sheer, black and immense, blotting out most of the sky. The river foamed white where it struck hidden rocks, its roar filling every crevice. Powell, notebook still in hand when he could manage it, named the place Separation Canyon, though the name would later carry far heavier meaning. It was here that doubt finally hardened into decision for three of the men. They had muttered for days, sometimes in whispers by the fire, sometimes in sharper tones when rapids swamped the boats. They spoke of turning back, of climbing out of the canyon rather than risking more rapids that might destroy them. Their fear was not cowardice, it was the fear of men who had seen enough to know that death could come swiftly on these waters. And in this gorge, with its towering black walls and thunderous voice, That fear found its sharpest edge. One evening, as the fire burned low and the canyon walls glowed faintly with reflected starlight, the three approached Powell. Their voices were steady, though quiet, as they told him they would go no farther. They would climb out of the canyon at dawn, scale the cliffs, and strike across the desert in hopes of finding Mormon settlements said to lie somewhere beyond. They believed the land, harsh as it was, offered a better chance of survival than the rapids that still roared ahead. Powell listened without raising his voice. He urged them to stay, reminding them that the end of the canyon could not be far, that the river, though fierce, had carried them this far. He spoke of maps yet to be made, of discoveries yet to be written, of the bond they had forged together. But his calm assurance, which had steadied them through so many trials, could not soften their resolve now. They had chosen their path. Imagine yourself there by the fire. The river murmurs nearby, its voice low and unyielding. The canyon looms black above, stars glimmering faintly in the narrow slit of sky. Three men stand, their faces hollow in lantern light, their shadows stretched long against the sand. Powell sits, his gaze steady, his words measured. The fire crackles, and silence falls between each sentence, heavier than stone. You sense the fracture, the inevitability of it, the canyon itself bearing witness to this quiet mutiny. The other men shifted uneasily, some muttering that leaving was madness, others glancing toward the cliffs as if considering the climb themselves. Tension hung thick, but no voices rose in anger. There was no shouting, no threats, only a solemn recognition that the river had divided them as surely as it had carved the canyon. Dawn came pale and cool. The fire had burned to ash, and the river gleamed grey in early light. The three men prepared quietly, packing what provisions Powell allowed them. Some flour, some dried apples, a little bacon, a rifle each. They tied their bundles with rough rope, slung them across their shoulders, and stood for a long moment at the edge of camp. The others watched in silence. No jokes, no farewells shouted. Only the sound of boots shifting in sand, the river murmuring behind, and the faint cries of ravens circling high above. And then they began to climb. Hands grasped ledges, boots scraped against stone, small pebbles rattled down as they pulled themselves upward. They rose slowly, their figures shrinking against the immense wall, until they were no more than silhouettes etched against the brightening sky. Powell stood watching, his face unreadable, his one arm folded across his chest. Perhaps he hoped they would turn back, or perhaps he knew they would not. The wow moment of that morning was not dramatic, not loud, but unbearably quiet, the canyon swallowing their footsteps. No echoes returned. Their boots struck stone, their breaths carried faintly, then faded into nothing. The silence was complete, as if the canyon had closed behind them. Now close your eyes and picture it yourself. You stand on the riverbank, the air cool, the light soft. You watch three men climb steadily upward, their figures dark against the pale sky. You hear the faintest sounds of stone and breath, and then even those are gone. All that remains is the river flowing on, indifferent, eternal. You feel the weight of separation press down, the canyon's silence larger than any words could fill. The remaining men turned back to the boats, their shoulders heavier, their voices subdued. They knew what Powell knew, that the desert above was vast, waterless, unforgiving. The chance of those three surviving was slim, though hope clung faintly, as stubborn as the river itself. They loaded the boats again, checked the ropes, gripped the oars. Powell did not speak of what had passed. He simply stepped into his boat, steady as ever, and gave the signal to row. The river caught them quickly, pulling them forward, deeper into the canyon shadow. Behind them, the three figures vanished from sight. Ahead, rapids still thundered, cliffs still rose, the unknown still waited. but within each man lay the silence of that morning, a silence that would never leave them. The river did not pause for grief. It carried the boats onward, tugging them deeper into the gorge, its voice as steady as ever. Yet every man felt the absence of those three figures, climbing the stone toward an uncertain fate. Their departure had left a weight heavier than any barrel of flour. Silence hung over the boats as they rowed, each stroke measured, each glance backward reluctant. The canyon walls pressed close, sheer and shadowed, and it seemed for a time as though the river would never relent. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the gorge began to change. The cliffs, once black and towering, softened in hue, their faces streaked with bands of gold and rose. The walls pulled back by degrees, widening the sky above, allowing sunlight to spill more freely across the water. The river, though still swift, seemed less menacing, its surface flashing with ripples that glittered under the sun. For the first time in many days, the men lifted their eyes from the oars and allowed themselves to hope. Powell noticed it too. He pointed upward, his voice steady, drawing their attention to the way the cliffs sloped gently now instead of rising sheer. Vegetation appeared in patches. Scrubby willows, tufts of grass clinging to ledges, even the faint outline of trees higher on the slopes. These were signs of transition, signs that the labyrinth of stone was loosening its grip. Imagine yourself in the boat with them. The air feels warmer, brighter. The cliffs, though still immense, no longer feel like prison walls, but like guardians stepping aside. You hear birds calling, real birds this time, not the echoing ravens of darker canyons, but sparrows and swallows darting in and out of cracks. Their wings flash in sunlight, their cries bright against the hush of water. You breathe more deeply, the scent of warm stone mingling with faint hints of greenery. The men murmured among themselves, voices carrying relief. One remarked that he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to row without shadows pressing down. Another swore that the air itself tasted sweeter here, as though the river had led them into a new season. Laughter came more easily now, not the brittle kind that cracked under strain, but genuine, flowing freely as the water itself. By midday, the gorge widened still further. The river curved through broad valleys where sunlight poured down unhindered, illuminating cliffs painted in warm tones. The men pulled their boats ashore, not from necessity but from desire, to stand, to stretch, to feel open sky above their heads. They lay on the sand, faces turned upward, eyes closed, letting the sun warm their tired bodies. Some stripped off damp shirts, letting them dry on rocks, while others simply lay still, breathing deeply as if to absorb the light itself. Powell, though as weary as they, walked slowly along the bank, notebook in hand, sketching the cliffs, noting the vegetation, recording the change. His words carried not only observation, but quiet gratitude. He had known the canyon could not last forever, but to see the proof, to feel it in sun on his face, was a relief beyond measure. Close your eyes now and picture the moment as they must have felt it. You're no longer hemmed in by black walls and thunderous rapids. Instead, you drift through corridors of light, the river shimmering gold beneath a sky that feels wide enough to hold hope again. The cliffs lean back, softened by colour, their silence gentler, their shadows less severe. You feel the burden of weeks lift, little by little, carried away on the current. That evening their camp was different. The fire burned brighter, not because there was more wood, but because their spirits fed it. Conversation rose easily, stories told without strain, laughter carrying into the open air. One man declared he would never again complain of bacon, so long as he could eat it in sunlight. Another carved another piece of driftwood, this time not with initials of survival, but with a crude sunburst, holding it aloft as if to toast the day's relief. The canyon, instead of swallowing their voices, seemed to let them drift upward into the open sky. Powell wrote by lantern again, his words steadier than in many nights before. He described the widening gorge, the warmth of the day, the sense of transition, but he also noted the absence of the three who had left. Their shadows lingered in his sentences, as if he could not write of hope without acknowledging the cost. Yet even his tone carried light, the calm recognition that survival was possible, that the river, though still demanding, had allowed them through. Now imagine yourself lying on the sand that night wrapped in a blanket, the fire crackling softly nearby. Above you spreads a wider slice of sky, stars bright but framed now by cliffs that no longer feel suffocating. The air is warmer, easier to breathe. You hear laughter drifting faintly, mingling with the river's steady voice. You feel hope, small but undeniable, rising with the stars. For the first time in many weeks, the men slept more easily. Their dreams were not filled with roaring rapids or silent walls, but with visions of open plains, of sunlight, of home. The canyon had not released them entirely, but it had loosened its hold, and in that loosening they found strength to continue. At last the canyon began to release them. The river, once coiled tight between walls of stone, widened into broader channels where the current no longer roared but carried them with steady, unhurried strength. The cliffs, though still high, leaned back and softened, their colours warmer, less severe. Light poured down more freely, filling the boats with golden glow. The men, gaunt and ragged, lifted their faces to the sun, their eyes squinting but bright with relief. It was August 30th, 1869. Nearly 100 days had passed since they had launched their boats at Green River Station, since bacon had been fresh and flour dry, since jokes had not been sharpened by fatigue. Their bodies bore the marks of the journey, hands blistered and scarred, clothes torn and stiff, boots worn thin. Yet they were alive, and more than alive. They had been shaped by the river as surely as the canyon walls had been, carved into something leaner, tougher, quieter. Powell sat at the stern of his boat, his one hand steady on the tiller rope. He gazed ahead as always, but now his eyes softened as the cliffs gave way to open country. He must have felt the relief of survival, the pride of endurance, the ache of loss. For though most of his men still rode beside him, 3 had chosen another path and vanished into the desert, their fate unknown but heavy in memory. Powell carried them with him, as he carried every page of notes, every sketch, every word etched into his journal. The river had taken much, but it had also given a story that would endure. Imagine yourself in that boat with him. The oars dip slowly, no longer battling waves, but gliding with ease. The air smells cleaner, fresher, touched by grasses instead of rancid bacon. You hear birds singing in trees along the banks, a sound long absent in the depths of canyon. The sky above feels immense, unbroken by towering stone, and the horizon stretches in a way that seems almost shocking after weeks of narrow corridors. You breathe deeply, feeling as though the world has opened for you again. The men pulled ashore on a sandy bank, not because they had to, but because they wanted to stand on solid ground, to feel the earth beneath their boots and know the worst was behind them. They staggered slightly, their bodies unaccustomed to such calm. One man dropped to his knees and scooped water in his hands, drinking as though it were a gift newly discovered. Another lay flat on the sand, arms spread wide, staring up at the boundless sky with a grin that looked half delirious, half grateful. Laughter rose, not sharp and brittle this time, but rich and warm. A laughter of release. Powell wrote in his notebook, his words clear despite his exhaustion. We emerge from the canyons at last, battered but alive. The river has given us passage, though not without cost. We are diminished in number, yet enlarged in memory. His lines, simple and steady, carried the weight of a journey no map had dared before. Close your eyes now and picture them standing together, a small band of survivors on the edge of the unknown. Their clothes hang loose on their frames, their faces weathered, their eyes bright with triumph and fatigue. Behind them the canyon stretches dark and endless, a labyrinth they had entered with trepidation and from which they had emerged transformed. Before them lies open land, sunlight spilling across it, a horizon that promises not only safety but remembrance. They pushed off once more, drifting through the final miles, the river calm, its voice softened. Towns lay ahead, people, food, the return of ordinary life. Yet none of that felt immediate. What mattered most was the stillness in their hearts, the knowledge that they had seen what no one else had seen, endured what few could endure, and carried each other through. That night, their last camp, the fire burned bright, fueled by driftwood gathered in abundance. The bacon was eaten without complaint, the coffee sipped slowly, the laughter full and unforced. They didn't speak often of what had been lost, of damp rations, of boats nearly wrecked, of men who had walked into silence. Instead, they spoke of home, of fields, of children, of wives waiting. The firelight painted their faces, turning every scar, every wrinkle, every hollow into a badge of survival. Powell sat apart for a time, gazing back at the canyon they had left. His lantern glowed faintly against his journal, but his eyes often lifted to the horizon. He knew that words could never fully capture the immensity of what they had seen, the silence, the fury, the beauty. Yet he also knew he would try, for that was his purpose. The river had given him its story and he would carry it forward. Now imagine yourself with them, lying back on the sand for one final night. The stars glitter above, no longer framed narrowly by cliffs but spread wide across the sky. The fire crackles beside you, its warmth steady, its smoke rising into open air. You close your eyes, and instead of hearing thunder or whispers of doubt, you hear only the calm murmur of the river, gentle now, carrying you into rest. When morning came, they would rise, push off one last time, and drift into the world beyond the canyons. But in this moment, at the edge of night and morning, the journey felt complete. The river had carried them, tested them, shaped them, and finally released them. The river had released them, but its presence never left. On August 30th, 1869, Powell and his surviving men emerged battered, gaunt, but alive. Their boats were scarred, their clothes in tatters, their rations nearly gone. Yet they carried something far greater than supplies: memory. They had travelled through silence deeper than any cathedral, through storms that split the sky, through rapids that thundered like armies. They had seen fossils of vanished seas, carvings of vanished hands, stars framed by canyon walls as if the heavens themselves had bent closer. The canyon had given them a story, and Powell carried it forward. In the years after, Powell did not return to battlefields or to the obscurity of classrooms. He became a voice for the American West, a scientist, a leader, a visionary. He spoke of rivers not only as wonders but as lifelines. He warned that the arid lands of the West could not be tamed by wishful thinking, that water would always be the true measure of settlement and survival. His words were sometimes ignored, sometimes resisted, but they carried the weight of a man who had felt rivers carve themselves into his very bones. Yet for all his later work, his leadership at the US Geological Survey, his advocacy for careful stewardship of water, it was the canyon descent that defined him. Those 100 days of hardship and wonder, of laughter and silence, of mutiny and survival, became his lasting legacy. He had not conquered the river, for no river can be conquered. He had listened to it, endured it, recorded it, and in doing so gave it a voice in the world beyond its stone walls. Imagine Powell in his later years, seated at a desk piled with reports and sketches, his empty sleeve pinned neatly as always, his one hand moving steadily across paper. Outside the window stretches a city, its streets loud with carriages, its air thick with smoke. Yet in his mind he still hears the hush of the canyon, still sees lightning split its black walls, still feels the pull of water surging beneath his boat. The world may call him professor, director, explorer, but he is always, in part, the quiet figure by a lantern, writing in a canyon no map had dared. Now close your eyes and picture yourself drifting once more on that river. The firelight is gone, the lantern dimmed, the canyon walls silent. Above you spreads the same narrow slice of sky Powell once gazed upon, stars scattered like silver dust across black velvet. The river hums softly beneath, carrying you forward with no need of effort, no need of thought. You breathe in the cool night air, and you feel the immensity of time pressed gently against you. You're part of it now, as Powell was, as the ancient hands who carved spirals into stone were. The river remembers, always. The wow moment of this ending is not thunder or storm, but continuity. The canyon flows still, unchanged, carrying echoes of that first descent. The same rapids roar, the same stars blaze, the same silence folds itself around the water. Powell is gone, his men are gone, but the river carries on, whispering to cliffs, shaping stone, holding memory. And you, listening now, share in that memory. You've drifted with them, felt their fears and their laughter, seen their lanterns glow against immense walls. The canyon has spoken to you as it once spoke to them. Powell's life after the river was full of words, reports, lectures, arguments, visions for the West. Yet none of those words ever surpassed the quiet authority of what he endured in silence. He showed that to journey is not always to triumph, but to endure, to witness, to remember. And the river, indifferent yet eternal, flowed on. Now rest here with him, with them, with the river. Imagine the boats moored on a sandy bank, their ropes creaking gently, the men sleeping beneath blankets worn thin, Powell still writing by lantern light. Then picture the canyon as it is tonight, silent, immense, the same river still flowing, still carving, still remembering. You are part of that silence now, carried gently by the current into dreams,